The security camera caught them first. Not a polished Hollywood reel, but the grainy mechanical eye of a device screwed to the eaves of their modest home in Eufaula, Oklahoma. In black and white flicker, the Jamisons shuffled back and forth like sleepwalkers, loading their white Dodge pickup in a rhythm that felt offbeat, ritualistic. It was October 8th, 2009, a Thursday afternoon, the kind of day that should have smelled of fried food from the diner down the road and with smoke from the lake houses. Instead, what clung to the air was unease. Bobby Dale Jamison, 44, lanky and slow-moving from years of back pain, carried boxes like he wasn't quite sure what was inside. His wife, Sherilyn, small and sharp-eyed, shouldered a brown briefcase with the determination of someone who wanted its contents unseen. Their 6-year-old daughter, Madison, hovered near the edges, sometimes climbing in, sometimes peering out from the doorway, the confusion of a child written in her stillness. Neighbors later replayed the footage like a cursed reel. Over and over, they watched the couple move as though in a trance, never speaking, never gesturing, never laughing. No hurried urgency, no clear destination, just a kind of eerie calm, a calm that, in hindsight, felt less like preparation and more like surrender. By evening, the truck rumbled out of their driveway toward the Sans Bois Mountains, a tangle of ridges and woods in Latimer County, where Bobby and Sherilyn claimed they wanted to buy 40 acres of remote land. It wasn't a strange idea in Oklahoma. Not really, a small parcel wilderness where you could breed, hunt, or start fresh. Yet the Jamisons didn't look like people pursuing a dream. They looked like people answering a summons only they could hear. For days later, hunters stumbled on the truck abandoned along a rough mountain road. The scene was bizarre enough to stop them cold. Wallets, IDs, cell phones, even $32,000 in cash still inside the vehicle. Their dog, Maisie, barely alive, whined from the back seat, ribs sharp as knives against her fur. No footprints leading away. No tire tracks veering off into the brush. The truck had been left as if its owners had simply opened the doors and vanished into thin air. The sheriff standing in the fading autumn light that week said quietly to his deputies, "Families don't just disappear," but standing there, staring into the shadow-choked pines, it looked like this one already had. The Jamison house on Red Oak Street was not the sort of place where mysteries were supposed to begin. A single-story home with beige siding and a patchy front yard. It looked like anywhere, like nothing at all. Yet when investigators stepped inside after the family failed to return, it felt less like a home and more like a stage abandoned mid-scene. The air smelled stale, curtains drawn tight against an October sun that had no reason to be kept out. Toys sat untouched in the living room. A half-finished project on the kitchen counter waited for hands that would never come back to it. Neighbors swore the Jamisons weren't the kind of family that left without saying something, yet here was silence pressed into every corner. Bobby's mother said he had been restless in the weeks before, distracted, muttering about spirits that lingered, about things unseen moving around the house. Sherilyn had filled her journal with sharper words, suspicions of betrayal, paranoia, even open anger toward relatives she claimed wished her harm. The entries read less like diary fragments and more like evidence, fragments of a mind building barricades against something invisible. But the strangest detail wasn't written in any journal. It was captured in that final, hypnotic recording from the security camera. Hours of the couple wandering in and out, loading possessions without clear purpose, as if they weren't just packing, as if they were evacuating. Yet nothing in the house suggested a family preparing for a trip. Clothes were still in closets. Favorite belongings left behind. Madison's toys untouched. What were they preparing for then? By October 12th, when deputies taped off the property, the house no longer looked like a domestic space. It felt hollow, as though the walls themselves had been vacated of meaning. And in that emptiness, every ordinary object became suspect. The Jamison story wasn't just about a family that vanished. It was about a house that refused to explain why. The hunters who found it weren't looking for mysteries. They were scanning the ridgelines for deer that October afternoon, rifles balanced across their shoulders, boots sinking into the mud-slick road that carved its way through the Sans Bois Mountains. What stopped them was a flash of white, a Dodge pickup parked askew, its tires half sunken into the earth as if it had been waiting for them. The truck looked abandoned but not wrecked. The doors were locked, but the windows gave away everything inside, and what they saw made their skin crawl. Cell phones on the seats, wallets with cash and cards intact, Bobby's and Sherilyn's IDs stacked like they'd been deliberately placed, a purse tossed across the console. And beneath it all, in the cab's shadows, a small dog alive but barely clinging on, her eyes glazed with hunger, ribs protruding like cruel bars beneath her fur. Then came the detail that hardened suspicion into dread. A bank envelope stuffed with $32,000 in cash. Not in a hidden compartment, not buried in the woods. Just sitting there in the open, as though money no longer meant anything to the people who had carried it. The deputies who arrived hours later circled the truck in disbelief. This wasn't robbery. No thief would leave behind money like that. Nor was it the aftermath of a carjacking. There were no skid marks, no signs of a struggle, no broken glass glittering in the dirt. The truck was parked carefully, deliberately, like its occupants had simply stepped out and vanished into the pines. Night fell hard in the Sans Bois, draping the mountains in the darkness so absolute it swallowed sound. The search teams brought dogs, flashlights, ATVs. Their beams cut through brush and cedar groves, but found only silence. No footprints. No discarded clothing. Nothing to explain why a family would abandon every lifeline they had, cash, IDs, phones. In the middle of nowhere, Sheriff Israel Beecham stood by the truck as the search wound down and said what no one wanted to admit. They didn't walk away from here on accident. The pickup sat under the moonlight like a puzzle with missing pieces, its engine cooled, its belongings untouched, its silence heavier than the woods themselves. And somewhere in that silence, 3 lives had gone missing without a trace. The security footage showed her clearly. Sherilyn, her dark hair falling across her shoulders, cradling a brown briefcase against her chest as though it carried something more vital than money, more private than paper. She placed it carefully in the truck bed that final afternoon, shut the tailgate with snap, and walked back into the house without looking up. That briefcase never turned up again. When investigators combed to the Jamisons' abandoned pickup days later, they cataloged every item left behind. Phones, wallets, IDs, even that impossible envelope of cash. But not the briefcase. Not the handgun Sherilyn was known to keep for protection. Those 2 objects, a satchel and a weapon, became the black holes of the case, swallowing theories whole. To the lawmen, the missing items pointed to human hands. Someone had taken them. Someone had made sure those 2 objects vanished while everything else stayed in place. To the neighbors, the details turned mythic. The briefcase became a cipher, a container for secrets, drugs, documents, something so valuable it justified the family's disappearance. Others whispered darker things. That Sherilyn had spoken of spirits in the house, of unseen forces pressing at the windows, and that maybe the briefcase was a talisman, carried not to trade but to protect. Every theory tripped over itself. If the Jamisons had been victims of a random robbery, why leave behind the cash? If they had staged their disappearance, why abandon their phones and IDs but guard a single briefcase? If they had been harmed, why take only those 2 things? The truth hung in the absence. Objects that should have been found were not. Evidence that should have explained only deepened the riddle. And as the months turned to years, the image of Sherilyn walking across her yard with that briefcase grew stranger, more haunting. A last artifact of intent in a story that had none. Out in the mountains, the pine trees thickened into silence, holding their secrets with a patience human beings can't bear. Somewhere between the house and that lonely stretch of road, the briefcase and the Jamisons had vanished together, and neither would ever be seen again. The Sans Bois Mountains are not vast by Western standards, but to the people of Latimer County, they might as well be endless. Ridges that roll into ridges, trails that vanish into scrub oak and cedar, creek beds that look the same in every direction. By October 2009, when the Jamisons failed to return, those woods became the center of a search that felt more like a hunt for ghosts. Sheriff's deputies set up their base at the edge of a logging road, radios crackling to the static of autumn wind. Volunteers poured in, ranchers in dusty hats, neighbors who refused to sit idle, Friends who carried flashlights and hunting knives, as if sheer numbers could pull a family back from a void. They spread out in long, uneven lines, shouting names into hollows that threw their voices back empty. Maisie, the Jamison starving dog, had already been pulled from the truck, whimpering in the arms of an officer. Her survival only deepened the dread. Whoever left that dog had not expected to return soon, or at all. For 2 weeks the woods echoed with search teams. Helicopters dipped low, their blades scattering branches. Horses clopped through creek beds. ATVs tore across ridges, their headlights sweeping over nothing. Search dogs picked up scents and lost them in circles. Every day ended the same way. Boots heavy with mud, flashlights extinguished, no sign of 3 missing people. By late October, whispers seeped in from the community. People spoke of Bobby's strange behavior in the months before, of his fascination with spirits and unseen presences. They recalled Sherilyn's sharp words in her journal, her talk of dark forces pressing at her family. Others muttered about drugs, about debts, about a deal that had gone wrong and ended in the pines. The forest didn't answer any of it. By November, the official search dwindled. Deputies packed their radios, volunteers returned to their farms, and the mountains resumed their quiet reign. The Jamison case slipped from urgent investigation into something colder. An open wound the land itself refused to close. For 4 years, hunters and hikers would pass through those same woods, feeling only the weight of silence, never knowing that just beyond their line of sight, the truth lay buried in shallow earth. By 2010, the Jamison family had already become a legend in Eufaula and the surrounding towns. People didn't just talk about them. They speculated, invented, and passed theories in hushed tones as if speaking too loudly might summon something from those hills. At church picnics, someone would always lower their voice and say, "Did you hear they were part of a cult?" At the diner in town, whispers circled over coffee. "No, I heard Bobby was in over his head with drugs. That's why they were up there." Others insisted they'd seen the Jamisons in the weeks before, pale, withdrawn, moving through stores like shadows, as if they were already halfway gone. Sherilyn's writings became a particular point of fascination. Her notebook, filled with angry rants and strange references to spiritual oppression, fed the idea that the family had been haunted before they even vanished. Some claimed she had written about a black book of witchcraft. Others remember her saying she believed their house was cursed, full of spirits she couldn't escape. Bobby's odd behavior only strengthened the story. Friends recalled him setting up surveillance cameras around the home, convinced dark forces or enemies were watching them. To some, it was paranoia. To others, it was evidence of a man who had already glimpsed a shadow that would eventually swallow his family. The white pickup truck, discovered abandoned in the mountains, became its own ghostly totem. Residents of Latimer County drove out just to see where it had been left, as if staring at the dirt pull-off might offer some answer. People shivered when they learned the dog had been left inside, alive but skeletal, a companion to silence. Months turned into a year, then 2, then 3. The Jamisons remained missing, but they were never forgotten. Instead, their absence grew larger than their lives had been. Children in town dared each other to walk the road where the truck was found. Teenagers whispered the name Jamison, as if invoking a curse. Adults simply shook their heads, unable to explain how a family could vanish so completely in a place they all thought they knew. The forest, meanwhile, said nothing. It stood like a sealed vault, holding back answers the community both feared and craved. By the time 2013 crept in, the case had shifted from a desperate search to something colder, a story that felt unfinished, but too tangled in shadows to ever be solved. Until one gray November day, the mountains gave back what they had taken. It was November 16th, 2013, when 2 hunters wound their way through the rugged slopes of the Sans Bois Mountains. The air was brittle, the forest floor littered with oak leaves that snapped underfoot like old bones. They weren't looking for anything except deer. Instead, they found the dead. Near a shallow rise, partly hidden under brush and rocks, lay the scattered remains of 3 bodies. The bones were sun-bleached, clothing in tatters, impossible to recognize at a glance. But the hunters didn't need names. The entire county already knew who had been waiting to be found. Sheriff's deputies swarmed the area, taping off the clearing with strips of yellow that fluttered uselessly in the wind. Forensic teams worked carefully, bagging each fragment, each shred of cloth, as if the woods might close up and take them back. The discovery site was less than 3 miles from where the Jamison truck had been abandoned. It felt impossible. Hundreds of searchers, dozens of dogs, helicopters sweeping the ridges. All of it had passed within a breath of this place, and yet the family had remained hidden for 4 long years. The mountains had protected their secret with silence, only giving it up by accident. The news spread fast, hitting Eufaula like a thunderclap. For years the Jamisons had been ghosts. Now they were bones. But the discovery did not quiet the town. It only sharpened questions. How had 3 people died here, together, so close to their truck? Why were there no signs of struggle, no clear evidence of foul play? The remains were too weathered, too broken down by time and elements, to give easy answers. Even the medical examiner's office could not declare a cause of death. Homicide? Suicide? Starvation? Exposure? Every theory returned like an echo, unanswered. In the end, all the authorities could say was simple and unsatisfying. The skeletal remains belonged to Bobby, Sherilyn, and little Madison Jamison. The forest had finally given them back. But not the truth. The Jamisons were no longer missing, but death did not deliver clarity. If anything, it deepened the shadows. Investigators sat in quiet frustration, sifting through years of speculation. There was no bullet hole in the bones, no neat sign of violence, no clear evidence to lock the mystery in place. Instead, the remains seemed to mock the living. 3 lives reduced to fragments, mute and unyielding. Theories swarmed like moths to light. Some pointed to murder. Perhaps the Jamisons had been lured to mountains for a deal gone wrong, drugs, money, or something darker. Their truck, their cash, their IDs left behind, as if the killers wanted to erase their trail. But why leave the bodies so close? Why not bury them deeper, or never at all? Others lean on the idea of suicide or a murder-suicide pact, fueled by the Jamisons' known struggles. Depression, paranoia, financial ruin. Maybe the woods had been their chosen end. But the image of Lil Madison in that scenario silenced many. Could parents who doted on their daughter have carried her into death? And then there were whispers that never left the county. Sherilyn's writings about spirits, Bobby's obsession with surveillance and unseen enemies. Friends remembered them speaking of witches, curses, and hauntings. Perhaps, some said with a shiver, the Jamisons hadn't been running from flesh-and-blood enemies at all, but from something older, something that waits in places where the trees knot together and light does not reach. The truth was simpler. Maybe the mountains are cruel. A wrong turn, a drop in temperature, an accident. Exposure can kill swiftly, even without malice. Families can die together without conspiracy. But even this explanation satisfied no one. Too many strange details, too much that didn't fit. Years passed, and the Jamisons slipped fully into legend. Their story became less about what happened and more about what could have. They became a riddle for late-night talk shows, for internet forums, for true crime obsessives and ghost hunters alike. But for those who knew them, it was quieter. The Jamisons were not theories. They were a son, a daughter-in-law, a child whose laughter once echoed in living rooms now emptied of sound. Their mystery was not just a puzzle but a wound, one the forest would never explain. And so the case rests where it began, in silence. A truck abandoned on a dirt track, a dog that lived, bones scattered in the leaves, and a question that hangs heavy as the hills themselves. What happened to the Jamisons in those woods? The mountains never answered.